That's one way to get them in here. Thank you very much. The work that Adam and I have been doing over the last year or so has actually been on India. And we're looking at changes that have actually occurred in India, more specifically the development of a middle class and the changing. The big change that's actually occurring is the change between what used to be the caste system to what now can be called an economic class system. I must say that Adam has done a lot of work on this, and we're continuing to work on it. What we're trying to do is look at it from a different perspective, a different spatial perspective. We're trying to reduce all of this national data to a state level. And we're looking at the variations across the state, across the country, at the different states to see where the impact, the economic impact, and the class impact is actually going to be greater across India itself, with its 28 different states within the country itself. So with that, Adam.
Thank you. So Dr. Morgan basically just gave my presentation, but we'll start over. Thank you, Dr. Morgan. As he said, my name is Adam Smart, and I'm a graduate student in the Public Administration Department. But I'm doing this research for the Geography Department, which was my undergraduate degree. And the title of my presentation is India Fortified, the Emergence of a Stratified and Gated Middle Class in India. Now, two things I want to point off right off the bat here are the words stratified and middle class, because those are the components that we're going to be focusing on today. So no talk can be had about any socioeconomic model without first discussing the process of globalization. Now, globalization, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is defined as the development of an increasingly integrated global economy marked especially by free trade, free flow of capital, and the tapping of cheaper foreign labor markets. And that's a fairly accurate assessment. And the process of globalization has revolutionized India's economic structure, which I'll go into further. Now, I have some stats here that really show India's economic growth, and this was alluded to by Mr. Brintley, but I don't think he's here. This was the stats of the last 4 decades in regards to India's economic growth. As we can see, it's been pretty steady, but at the turn of the 21st century is really when we see phenomenal growth, starting right here about 2001. And if we compare the GDP from 2000 to 2012, we can see that it's almost a tripling effect, which is rather significant when we're talking about developing countries. Now, from macro to micro, identifying India's middle class. We can't really talk about India's middle class if we don't know how to define it. And there's certain characteristics that we can use to help with this identification process. Now, rising incomes typically lead to significant changes in spending patterns, and the consumption of luxury goods are increasing. Two very indicative factors. Now, some examples I have here are two-wheeled forms of transport are being replaced by small car ownership. An increase in durable goods such as TVs, large furniture, refrigerators, and other electrical appliances are being consumed or purchased, and consumers are tending to spend proportionally less on basic necessities and more on discretionary items, which essentially means the average middle-class Indian is now at a spot, a socioeconomic level, that allows them to buy things that they want as opposed to things that they need. Which is another very important factor when we're studying the increase or the development of socioeconomic levels. Now, going on with this new middle class, higher levels of income have led to what can only be defined as a middle class, and I have a comparison between the US and India as to what defines a middle class for both of our countries respectively. Now, this new economic strata demands exclusivity, or the capacity to exclude others or certain segments of the Indian society that they deem unacceptable. And from caste to class represents a socioeconomic transformation occurring in India. So what I mean by this is, formerly, we had a system in which was, the title was called the caste system, and this was a socioeconomic model that was based primarily on religion, as opposed to income and things of that nature. Now, what we're seeing is something that resembles more of a westernized tradition, where your position in society really depends on your profession, not so much where you were born. So that's why we have titled it caste to class. Now, moving on into the fortified component that I mentioned in the title, we're seeing the rise of gated communities all across India. Now, by definition, gated communities are walled and gated residential developments that restrict public access. And the desires of those within these gated communities typically reflect the desires of the nouveau riche, or the upwardly mobile professional class in society. Now, some of these aspects include a desire for Western indulgences, exclusivity, which I previously mentioned, and access to social amenities such as clean water and uninterrupted power supply, which is a rather big deal in India because much of the population does not have access to these basic necessities that we here in the West usually take for granted. And money and private contractors provide what the state cannot. So, moving away from the physical component, we're starting to see other barriers emerge in regards to this social stratification. And I've titled this slide Invisible Fortifications to kind of highlight that. Now, physical boundaries are not the only form of socioeconomic barriers. Instead, we're seeing those that resemble aspects commonly found in the West. The separation is not only delineated by walls, but instead by zoning, aesthetics, culture, and class, which is another very westernized way to separate peoples. Now, strategies of this separation include assertive claims on public space, politics of distinction, and socio-spatial distancing from poor and working classes, which, like I said, can manifest itself in both physical and non-physical, I should say, by physical and non-physical means. Now, I've made some maps here that try to put this disparity in a visual perspective. Okay, so these are elevation maps, and these elevation maps, what they tell you is the places we see with higher elevation typically have higher levels of disparity, and this disparity is being measured by the consumption per capita. Okay, so when we look at a state-by-state comparison of both rural and urban, we don't see much, how should I say this, much change, but when we look at the within-state disparity, we see great levels of disparity in individual regions, such as Maharashtra, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, that's what AP stands for, and West Bengal. And that's because these areas have high rural populations and also high urban populations. And they're also commercial sectors, which will tend to increase areas of high populous stratification. I'm kind of just making a term up, so I hope you enjoy that. And the consequences of this stratification. Now this is really what we're focusing on. There's numerous consequences, but for the purposes of this research, stratification is being fueled by the rapid rise of the middle class, and the current process of stratification is leading to spatial and social fragmentation of cities and urban areas, which has many ramifications, but some of the most important ones I've listed here. And they are socioeconomic polarization and tension amongst classes, which tends to lead to class warfare, which is very important when we're discussing an economy that is still developing, okay? So moving forward, why should the global community be concerned? Well, I should retitle this and say, why should we be concerned and interested? Because there's many reasons we should be concerned and interested. Because in regards to the interest, there's all kinds of different ways to approach this from a sociological perspective and a psychological perspective and things of that nature. But in regards to the concern problem, I think the two things we should focus on are both humanitarian and economic. Now, obviously, from a humanitarian sense, when we see things like, give me 1 second. When we see things like this, this should arouse some kind of moral, inclination to help and be concerned. But in regards to the economic component, when we have things like socioeconomic polarization and class warfare in an economy that is so critically important to the global economy, we should pay close attention and be very much concerned with the development because we live in a globalized world. And with this comes certain responsibilities by all member nations. And if we have something like this going on, it affects us all in both a positive and negative light, depending on the situation. So with that, this is a developing project. And I do plan to do more things, such as long-term implications of class stratification, the education levels of women in urban and rural areas, and research within and between the urban and rural areas in response to environmental degradation, health, and welfare. And with that, I will open up for questions and conclude.